The aim here is to build a construction of my own self, providing the layers of observation that form my perception. Lessons I have learnt. Going back to the start, all building towards a certain outcome in a certain part of myself, a certain element that is awareness and control over my own actions. So what I will do is build you towards this end position, a position where all that is important is known to the self, and all action from its body controlled towards relevant action in its servitude. Discoveries made. I will describe them. I will build one after the other. So, I will start with an observation. There was an observation within myself where I saw that I could do more within the time that I had. I saw that I had options towards intervention within the actions that took place from myself, that I could increase the volume of valuable action. So, moving forward, I observed my own self. I saw what type of actions were exhibited from my body. I saw their characterization, and I considered an alternative characterization that I deemed more fitting. I saw that feelings, things, experiences, the enjoyment and suffering within one's emotional self, I saw that was the directing component within myself, and I gave it some consideration. I held an appraisal, an assessment of value, where I checked it. My appraisal brought an alternative perspective wherein which I saw that no relevance to value was held towards the adhering to emotional servitude, that endorsing the suggestions of emotions had zero basis in positive effect. And so with this in mind, I let go of this endorsement. I formed a neutral perspective. I began to observe my feelings and not act on them. I began to study where my feelings traced back to and create recognitions of such sources and personalized determinations. This is where I created my own judgments and endorsed those, accepted those as being what I value, and allowing my prior emotionally sourced determinations of the world to decay into nothing. Rather than doing things that minimized discomfort and maximized enjoyment, I let go of the endorsement of this mindset from the result of seeing its intangible basis in positive impact in the world, and started to allow myself to exist in an observing position to these feelings without reflexive action, wherein which I widened my versatility as a person, opened up myself to all options of action in all cases of situation, as I had no more emotionally inputted blockages to deter me from my duty. So, with this in mind, I had a new foundation for my path, a new consideration for myself now, as without the endorsement of emotionally determined direction to my life, I was at that point in myself left with nothing else. No other element of direction. So, I was indeed more versatile, but towards what that versatility was being used for, there was not any particular productivity valuable in this world. So, a consideration had then came to mind, an observation of duty. I saw that I existed doing nothing, my life going nowhere, and so I decided that it was unfitting of me to not be putting myself towards a purpose. And so I started to create direction, things that I valued doing for the sake of servitude. These elements of purpose began to teach me a new component of myself. In recognition of value now, in this point in time in my life, back then, actions that I valued doing, a new recognition was now available to me. A recognition of a separation between the actions of my body and the things that I valued. So then, action, separation, desynchronization, things that I was noticing. I saw a person, not myself, but a pilot to the actions of my body, doing things that I may or may not have cared for, that I may or may not have cared to do. Knowing that I was in a passenger seat position to the actions of my body, I decided to start studying this alternative operator that happened to have been in the pilot seat of my body's actions. I started to gain understanding of its characterization, That way I could decide what needed to be done with it. I gave it a name and started to take notes. I learned some things that showed its insufficiency. I saw that it was a harm to its own self, that it caused its own suffering, and was at least at odds with that which it cared for. And so from that position I decided I ought to make it disappear, just for its own sake. It was so discontented from the threat of not doing the things that it had its mind set on doing, seeing that it would needlessly destroy things in the presence of impedance to what it cares for, seeing that it would fall into a self-destructive despair in the presence of sense to futility in its goals, in the presence of significant chances of failure, seeing that it would have all these impeding feelings, it was very distinctly at need of being overridden, overhauled. If not only just due to the element of discontent, as if it cared so much to be happy, the discontent that it felt in the presence of a need for flexibility in the ever-changing movement of life, such discontent simply was at odds with its own value. If it cared to be happy so much, it was not the right operator for this body, as it would exist in a form of pure unacceptance, emotional, visceral unacceptance of its own existence, as soon as it was threatened with the need to change and do things differently and abandon the habituated paths that it was attached to. So it was very much not suitable for its own self, simply in need of removal by its own judgment, let alone mine. So it did indeed start to work towards creating its own replacement. Did I mention all of the harmful characteristics? No, there is also fear, which was also a nice observation. So these were all elements that I studied of characteristics tied to this operator. And as I went down the path of replacement, in my testing I began to make it more definitive that which was exclusively tied to this operator that I will call the unconscious operator. So, the unconscious operator, through the studying of it, certain characteristics were observed, its ineffectivity was observed, and its ineffectivity, particularly in comparison to a theoretical overhaul, was observed, to be more specific. As if it is all that is available, then it's not really ineffective, it's just something that we have to learn to work with. But my tasking was one of overhaul, one of change. So, I did indeed start to formulate a new approach. And what I made was a self-seeing approach. So, self-seeing operation. It was quite simple what my replacement was going to be, as in knowing that I was in the passenger seat of my body's actions and not in the piloting position, I knew that I technically was dead, and that the solution would therefore be to bring myself to life. I knew that I, in the actions of my body, was not present, that I was not existing or living, and it was the route to take in the removing of the unconscious operator for my conscious, self-seeing self to be that replacement. And so I started to create the foundation at which I could make this possible. Self-seeing operation, action wherein which your real self is present in the actions themselves, was observed to have certain key prerequisites. One requirement was pre-sighting of action. It was logically determined that the self-seeing operator could not possibly enact action from nothing. That this was the operator who acted out of something rather than nothing. This was the antithesis of nothing. There was no possibility in which it could just do without having something in a tangible form for it to do. And so with this in mind, it gave me a directing point in this construction of this new self, this new piloting operator of my body. I had to find a way to provide actions to my self-seeing self. Providing actions for its execution was the task at hand. As such would be the path that it could tangibly traverse over. I had that goal. And so I began to start testing ways to provide this direction for myself. And one of the key parts of this foundation for direction was establishing a core purpose. You see, up until this point, I had been doing things in servitude of the unconscious operator. I was the unconscious operator, recognizing my own insufficiency towards my own emotional cares, and guiding myself towards an escape. And whilst I had found some escape from that through the acceptance of this new self-seeing operator, whilst I had established some greater neutrality within myself, it was not stable. It would always fall apart, and I would always eventually fall back into the depths of my unconscious self. And so the time came to create a more tangible basis within action. I recognized that I needed a definitive pointing direction for myself, or else myself would always keep falling away. So I had the new task of choosing one. A thought process was enacted, the question was asked, and the conclusion was reached. I gave myself hypothetical situations, but it all came down to the two key elements. It came down to the elements of suffering and enjoyment. And when I asked myself if I had the option to take someone from a place of neutral experience to enjoyment, would I do it? The answer was yes. When I asked myself if I could take someone from the place of suffering to neutrality, would I do it? And the answer was yes. With these components in mind, I saw that it was within my soul to care for these elements of existence. I saw this to be my needed duty for my own self, seeing that these were the two parts of myself that I inherently cared for. I knew they were the right things to have be my core purpose, provided to this new self-seeing operator. So, I gave it a name, a shortened version of universal maximization of enjoyment and minimizing of suffering, shortened down to UniMaxMin, and shortened even further just to being my core purpose. And so now I had something to tie my self-seeing operator to, for itself to become more sustainably held in the piloting role of my body's actions. So, this piloting role was still not sustainably established. It was somewhat workable to an extent, except things kept falling away, and I kept being undone in my care for my life and what I value. As months passed and I made progress, fell out of care and then resumed the same progress again and then fell off again, I realized that simply the progress of my understanding was not being retained. That it was now time to study the definitive observations that have been made. It was now time to retain the key components so that I can start building this foundation and holding on to it. So from that position, I very much realized that I had to start retaining information. And so I constructed a new format of thinking where I would consolidate the placement of key observations. I would repeat the key observations that have been made for the progress of my own self until they felt secure in my mind, familiar and easy and quick to retrieve. And lo and behold, I started to accumulate progress, making no further losses of critical information. So, the observations were solidified, the progress was maintained, and I began to move forward. I had established a foundation for progress, but I still hadn't established the most tangible placement of myself within the actions of my body. A new foundational element needed to be inputted, one that I knew about but hadn't retained in awareness yet, being death of the mind's self. This component, once added to the foundations, the retained components, created a consistent entry point for the conscious, self-seeing operator to be present in the actions of my body. The pilot seat, by default, is full. The self-seeing operator does not get to do whilst the unconscious self is actively doing. The observation was that when you, as the first self being the unconscious operator, when you as the first self accept death of the mind's self, you are relinquishing action, freeing up the pilot seat of your body, and if ready with replacement, providing the self-seeing operator, the second self, providing the second self access to the piloting position. And so from this point, you now had a consistent entry point for the second self. The second self now just needed to do something, because it was not enough for there to be a place for the second self. That there needed to be action, and it had already been established that for action there must be direction. There must be something in the awareness, something to be done. And so, simply it was now the task to create actions. Actions for the second self. Pre-sight of action was devised. Pre-sight of action is the task to see action before action is done. So, this pre-sight of action, this is the foundational component to having things be done by the second self. It is the seeing of what is to be done before doing occurs. Implement this, and you will do as your conscious self. But there's still more things to figure out from that position. As with now the effective action from the second self is not inherently wise. It is just pure control. It's characterized by pure logical action, pure will towards duty. When there is no duty, it doesn't do anything. It exists in a reactive position, doing anything that comes to mind in response to the world, doing things around it. I observed this. The observation was made that I existed, and all the things that I knew I could have done to achieve towards my purpose was not being done. I saw that my self-controlled actions were not wise. They were just present and reactive to the world, not accounting for critical information needed to make good decisions, or optimal decisions. Because at this point they were good, just not optimal. Whereas previously they were bad and destructive. So, I will move on to this point of proactive, informed decision making. We are looking at proactivity here. We are looking at how to make your self-seeing operator do what needs to be done towards your core purpose. It really just comes down to seeing the future. It came out of the question, what would I have done if I had a choice? What would I have done differently if I could have done something. Because I could see that I would have done things differently if I just had chosen to do something. If I just had a choice. And so, I devised a way to make that choice come into life in action rather than in retrospect of the past. I saw it as a model where I knew that if I could see it in the past, I could somehow begin to see it in the future just by flipping the format, just by utilizing that same question, but from a position that you know you will end up being in. You are stopping yourself from only reactively seeing where you are and knowing what you could have done, and just pushing that mindset forward into the future. Where am I in the future? What could I have done differently? This idea was the foundation for my proactivity now. It's the foundation for my wisdom. It allows me to account for critical information within my decision making. Because now I have proactive strategy. My proactive strategy goes towards where I know I will end up in the absence of intervention. So you can ask yourself, in the absence of intervention, where will I end up? And then you can start to consider, what will you need to do? The ideas of what you will need to do will naturally be derived from these observations of your future. You will, in asking this question, you will see where you will end up. It will open up an opportunity for you to consider what you can do differently, and it will allow for that proactivity. These components, they tie the actions to my core purpose. So what you must remember is this goal. This goal acts as the inception point. It is what births these components into yourself. It's what inspires them. Without this core purpose, you can know all of these other elements and simply not care to use them. And so you must bind yourself to the servitude of your core purpose, retaining the awareness of such, utilizing the prediction of your future in the absence of intervention by seeing that you are going to forget to bind your action to your core purpose. And so what you can do differently is retain through an information retention technique. So now what I will show you is how to retain all this information effectively. You will need to organize your mind and establish retrievable pockets of information. So, certain components, everything will need a title. For me, I've chosen Blin. Blin, the term, to represent the information of optimal decision making. So, Blin, you study, you summon the term, and you summon its contents. And this acts as the approach. You must repeat it to the point at which it feels strongly familiar in your mind. You must simply fight the continuous decay of memory for critical information. And so, you create these terms, you retain the information. The idea here now is to retain information with that certain approach, repeated retrieval, configuration into a definitive word format that is unchanging and reaches a point of secured placement within your mind where it is persistently retained without decay. In knowing that all information is decaying, you will need to come back to crucial information and repeat the re-retrieval of it intermittently, as much as you deem is necessary. You can keep tabs on how secure your information is feeling just by feeling it. You can really feel how familiar information is, how much it needs to be retained or not, just by retrieving it and sensing how snappy or distant it feels. That is what you need to do to retain the information. And that's the foundation to you keeping this information and keeping everything that you learn. So, those are some key foundational elements to that which characterizes me. So, at this point, I play a game of cooperation. I'm here to teach. So, whilst I have given what I can see as the foundation of myself, other people may be missing components that they personally need. So if you ever think you might be missing something or need further guidance, you can contact me through the internet. You can speak to me in person, and I will help ensure that you have all that you need to reach this level of control and awareness. So just make sure that you are studying yourself, keeping track of what actions you are taking so that you know where you're at with your progress. Make sure you are keeping notes of who you are in practice, who you are in the true life of your actions, not who you think you should be and who you think you could be. That way you can actively treat the things that are wrong inside of you. That way you can truly know what needs to be adjusted and fixed. So make sure you're keeping those notes, taking those notes on your own self, how you are behaving, diagnosing things, fixing things. That's a key component. That way you have a tangible understanding of what's really happening in your own self, in your own world. And it's not guessing and assuming. Cool. That's all.